Hello and welcome again to History 3394, the official history class of the 2004 Olympic Games. Finally, got a giggle out of you guys. Anyway, last week we were talking about Latin America and the Good Neighbor Policy, and I'll finish that today, and then we'll start talking about World War II, which it's really kind of difficult. There's so much going on. I've actually taught entire courses in it, and what I'm going to try to do is compress that into a very brief period. So if it seems disjointed, please forgive me, and feel free to ask questions, obviously, at any time. But after this, we're going to try to cover pretty much the whole war, or get as far as we can into it today. But the Good Neighbor Policy. Remember, the point of that, FDR was trying to change the tactical approach to Latin America. In the 20th century, from the War of 1898 onward, the United States had been heavily involved in Latin America in the most coercive and often brutal ways. A series of military occupations and interventions in Haiti and the Dominican Republic and Cuba and all over the place. And we'll talk some more about that today. And what FDR wants to do is to change that. It's kind of a version of what Taft had explained with dollar diplomacy. We're going to replace dollars with bullets. So instead of sending in armies of occupation, we're going to send in, the money doctors. That kind of thing. And we'll see how it works out. It doesn't change the nature of the relationship. The U.S. still has power, has hegemony, has control over Latin America, and will continue to for decades. What it tries to do is to change the nature of a relationship, the strategy, the tactics. Remember what Roosevelt said. They think they're as good as we are, and many of them are, so let's give them a chance. We started talking about the Dominican Republic, and I got as far as the kind of emergence of Rafael Trujillo. Trujillo was a general, a military general with the Guardia, which the U.S. helped set up. In 1930, he wins the presidency in an absurd election in which he gets 224,000 votes to only 1,900 for his opponent. He didn't even need Jeb Bush to take care of it for him. He was very closely connected to American businessmen who were dominated the sugar industry in the DR, and he amassed himself a personal fortune of $800 million, which in today's money would be many billions. There is a dispute as to who FDR was referring to when he said this, but it could have been Trujillo. FDR at one point says, sure, he's a son of a bitch, but he's our son of a bitch. So this is Trujillo. From 1930 until 60 or 61, when he's deposed, Trujillo runs a very brutal country with heavy American support, heavy American knowledge. His military officers train in the United States. He receives significant amounts of aid from the U.S., military aid, technological aid. American businesses heavily invested in the Dominican Republic. So it's certainly not in any way an exaggeration to suggest that the U.S. For the long term was underwriting the Trujillo regime. Trujillo met the one test, the only test that really mattered. He wasn't a communist, and he allowed American capital in. And those mean the same thing. When they talk about somebody's anti-communist credentials, it basically means that they are responsive to the intervention of American capital, and Trujillo clearly was. And whenever somebody in the Dominican Republic challenged that, whether it be labor leaders or human rights activists or socialists or communists or whoever, they would be dealt with incredibly forcefully. So the number of people who were disappeared, the number of attacks or massacres or jailings was always very, very high. Okay, and what we're going to do is kind of just run through several case studies of the several examples. And the next is Nicaragua. And you may know a little about Nicaragua, even though you're young, because it became a major issue again in the 70s and again in the 1980s when the United States very directly intervened in Nicaraguan politics to try to overthrow a government there. But for the Nicaraguans, this was kind of, as Yogi Berra would say, deja vu all over again, since the same thing had happened at the turn of the century. Between 1912 and 1925, we already mentioned this, the U.S. actually occupied, the Marines physically occupied Nicaragua. They left for a year, but then came back in 1926 on these absurd, contrived charges of Bolshevism. There are Bolsheviks, there are communists in Nicaragua, we have to send the troops back in. This is what President Calvin Coolidge said, and everyone said, there was actually a great deal of outcry in the United States against this, just as there was with the Dominican Republic. There were a lot of people who questioned this, who challenged it, who criticized it, who opposed it, including, senators, anti-imperialist senators. And so Coolidge catches a lot of flack for this. Why are you, attacking Nicaragua? And he says, we're not. We're not making war on Nicaragua any more than the policeman on the beat is making war on passersby. Remember the Roosevelt corollary. The U.S. is the policeman. And this is the imagery that Coolidge is going to invoke. The Nicaraguans, of course, see it much differently. When the American Marines come back in, is that just kind of a stabilizing influence? No, they see it much differently. One Nicaraguan said, the machos are coming, they will burn our houses. Quite aware of what had happened in the previous decade and more. One of the reasons the U.S. came back in was because there was a very strong and growing nationalist movement already inside Nicaragua, which was trying to eliminate foreign influences and actually create a new society at home. And it was led by, the name is up there, General Cesar Augusto Sandino. And if you're familiar with Nicaragua in the 70s or 80s, what was the name of the government and the army there? The Sandinistas, named after Sandino. He is kind of a George Washington figure in Nicaragua. Sandino was a socialist and a nationalist. He was both. He believed that not only did the Nicaraguans have to be able to control their own country, that they should have self-determination, that they should have sovereignty, but that Nicaraguan society had to be reorganized differently, that the peasants had to be given land, that these major corporations shouldn't rule the country. He often ranted against what he called the corrupting vice of the dollar in Nicaragua. Dollar diplomacy, right? And he also would attack the Monroe Doctrine. Sandino said, well then, this is from the writings of Cesar Sandino. It was a proclamation called to abolish the Monroe Doctrine. Sandino says, well then, deeply convinced that the grotesque Yankee imperialism day by day is infiltrating the domestic and foreign policy of Central America, turning our cowardly leaders into mummies, the vibrating spirit of the Indo-Hispanic race becomes at this time the autonomous army of Central America to save its racial dignity, flinging militarily, politically, and economically away from its territory the Wall Street bankers who control Nicaragua. Even if to do this we will have to leave our bodies dead, lying face up towards the sun. The autonomous army of Central America declares abolished the farcical Monroe Doctrine, and by the same declaration annuls the right that said doctrine pretends to have to enmesh itself cowardly in the political life, domestic and foreign, of the Indo-Hispanic republics. We do not protest against the magnitude of the intervention, but simply against intervention. The United States has gotten into the affairs of Nicaragua for many years. We cannot rely on their promise that someday they will leave from here. This is Sandino setting out the rationale for taking up arms against the American occupation based on American power, racial identity, and issues like this. Sandino immediately then becomes a major enemy of the United States. He's no better than a Bolshevik. He's no better than Lenin or Stalin or anybody else because he is challenging the supremacy of the dollar of American corporations. So the United States sends between 5,000 and 6,000 Marines, and Nicaragua is a very small country. Okay. Don't know how well you can see this, but this is Nicaragua here, a fairly small country. And the U.S. sends between 5,000 and 6,000 Marines in to hunt down Cesar Augusto Sandino. It is a bloody and ruthless war of counterinsurgency. And Sandino, here's an account from one of the battles, and again to show just how difficult this was. Sandino writes about a battle not far from El Chipote, which we call the Battle of Los Flores, and it's the biggest defeat we suffered in 6 years of war against the U.S. Marines. There my army found itself damaged and scarcely in a state of reorganization after the defeat. Look, Roman, the Yankees fought in their own way, with school tactics and with great confidence and self-control, in squads, and with those squads arranged in formations. I would have preferred to avoid that encounter, because the system I had decided to use was that of my guerrillas and not of pitched battles. Still, we were forced to meet them in battle, and the fight was dreadful, and our primitive technique of scattering with each soldier seeking his way out just wasn't possible this time, because we'd been surprised and we were surrounded, and of course it's much easier to target a group than an individual who's running away. In spite of everything, we defended ourselves as fiercely as we were attacked. I don't know what would have been the results from between the two techniques. Maybe they would have beaten us, but not in the disastrous way they routed us. Because at the most critical moment, and this is in a small village in Nicaragua, the damned airplanes came in to protect the Marines. They killed a large number of my soldiers and spread total disorder in my ranks. But airplanes are not. That battle was a total victory for the Marines, who furthermore captured a large quantity of equipment and food we were transporting to El Chipote. But again, just think of that. We see pictures on the TV all the time of air power, and you're kind of casual about it. But in 1928, to be in a small village in Nicaragua, to be attacked by Marines, and then to have airplanes appear as air support to start attacking you from the skies. Okay, this is terrifying, and this was referred to by the Nicaraguans and by the Dominicans and others as terror warfare, as terror tactics. And in fact, some of the theorists of air war actually devised it specifically that way. So this is this is part. Yeah.
Why were the group, like they wanted to use guerrilla tactics in Nicaragua?
Yeah.
Why was it so ineffective for them? And so I guess in Vietnam it wasn't effective for this.
Yeah, the question is about the effectiveness of guerrilla tactics in Nicaragua. I mean, it actually wasn't that ineffective. I mean, these guys held off the Marines for well over 10 years, the Sandino's army. At the end of the day, I mean, they're simply outgunned. In addition to that, it's very difficult to I mean, guerrilla warfare is incredibly political, right? You have to have a good number of people on your side. Mao Zedong would later say, in guerrilla warfare, the fighters are the fish, but the people are the water. Meaning that unless you have the support of the people, they're the water you need in order to swim. If not, you die, right? And it's very difficult with the Americans. First 6,000 Marines is somewhat frightening because the level of firepower they have compared to the Nicaraguans is overwhelming. And it's real easy to harass and threaten people and to intimidate them. I mean, the Sandinistas eventually lost an election mainly because of that, because the Contras, were so effective in causing mayhem. And ultimately, I mean, the Marine occupation is more stabilizing than, the thought of getting attacked at any moment. So I think a lot of it has to do with that. But I mean, it was really a fairly impressive guerrilla performance, too, if you consider, what they were up against. Yeah.
What part of the country did they target? Was it like the later part where they targeted the Pacific side, or?
In the, I'm trying to see if any of this is on the map. I think Sandino was probably on toward the Pacific side, kind of in the mountainous regions. It's guerrilla war. They're trying to, escape. But, the army isn't huge. It's not big. It's a small country. So Vietnam, we'll talk about that at great length. It's totally different. I mean, Vietnam's a pretty big country for one thing. Huh? Yeah. I mean, Vietnam's a pretty big country. I mean, at the same time, and I don't really want to get into it in great deal, and James will do this, in Nicaragua you do have a government which is working closely with the United States. I mean, the government in Nicaragua that Sandino is trying to get rid of is actually an American puppet government. In Vietnam you don't really have that. The U.S. basically has to invent a government, but no one supports it. So in Vietnam, you really have the massive majority of the people opposed to the Americans there. And in Nicaragua, it's much more difficult. And it's 1928. And the firepower, I mean, the technology is really, really drastic, too.
So Sandino wasn't in power?
Sandino was never in power, no. He was the head of the guerrilla army the whole time. He was a nationalist hero, but he was never, in power. There's an interesting, there was a famous general in both Korea and Vietnam, well, he retired before Vietnam, but in Korea, especially World War II in Korea, named Matthew Ridgway. He actually was the head of American UN forces in Korea for a while. And I was looking through Ridgway's archives once to study some stuff about Vietnam, and he was talking about Nicaragua. I didn't realize this, but he was there in the 1920s in the army, in this occupation force, Matthew Ridgway. He was an army officer. And at the time, they were having elections, and these were phony elections, with the American candidates all certain to win. And Ridgway was there, I think, as an election commissioner to make sure the election was allegedly free. But it was really striking because Ridgway said, what I saw down there really kind of blew me away. And Ridgway starts talking about, this is an American military officer, a junior officer at the time, and he starts talking about the legacy of Spanish imperialism and the class distinctions and how Sandino represents the campesinos, and it was really striking. He got it. He understood. And he said, kind of basically what he said, subliminally was, no wonder they hate us and they hate the Marines and they hate the government down here because the Americans are here ripping them off. And it was always telling that he wrote that, and no one really paid much attention to it. So he becomes really critical of Vietnam. And I've always figured that in his head, he was thinking, man, I remember when I was in Nicaragua and I saw this, and the Vietnamese are doing the same thing for the same reasons. So there was a huge outcry at home. There were a lot of people here in the United States, senators and, you know, newspapermen who said, why is the U.S. in Nicaragua? Leave these people alone. It didn't go far. But, I mean, Sandino was dealing with, I think, what are appropriately called terror tactics. I mean, the Marines went in there. It was bloody. It was ruthless. It was counterinsurgency warfare. So it leads to a great deal of criticism. The United States is aware of that criticism, and it generally is. And it does the same thing it's about to do in Iraq on June 30th, 2004, which is to remove itself from the formal trappings of power, right? So the U.S. can say, well, we're not in charge anymore. The so-and-sos, the Nicaraguans are, the Vietnamese are, the Iraqis are, whoever. The U.S. decides to do this, too, in order to remove itself from the direct line of fire, even though they're still calling the shots. So what they do is they decide to create, and they'll do this throughout Latin America, a National Guard. We've talked about that with regard to the DR already, a Guardia, in order to maintain the regime that the U.S. has established. The Guardia in Nicaragua was led by a man who would be around for a long time named Anastasio Somoza, General Anastasio Somoza, and Somoza's, I believe it was his son, not his grandson, it was his son, was actually the one who was overthrown by the Sandinistas in 1979. Samosa led the National Guard. Samosa was on very good terms with the Americans, with American businessmen, and he took over in 1933. He took over the Guard. In 1936, he seized power. He became the dictator of Nicaragua. And in addition to that, it was his National Guard, along with Marine support, who captured Sandino. There had been an agreement that Sandino would come in and talk to them. When Sandino shows up in Managua, he's murdered. So Somoza sets him up, which wasn't terribly surprising. So Somoza becomes the dictator of Nicaragua from 1933 to... why did I just do that? From 1933 to 1979, when he's finally overthrown. Now, this is kind of ironic. You have a situation, I don't want to go into this too much, but if any of you have ever read or taken Dr. O'Brien's classes or read his books, he talks about this a lot. One would think that Samosa and Trujillo and these people would be so beholden to the U.S. and so overwhelmingly thankful for putting them in power that they would kind of be puppets. But in fact, they're in a situation, and we'll see this especially with regard to Vietnam, where if you owe your existence to the U.S., that actually gives you leverage. How? Because the United States needs you there. The U.S. needs Trujillo, and it needs Somoza, because the alternative would be, you know, rebels or Sandino or whatever. So Somoza starts griping at the United States. He starts complaining. He says, you guys are restraining our development. You know, your businessmen are dominating our economy, and we Nicaraguans aren't getting, we're not getting our beaks wet. So, and again, you know, this is Nicaragua here, and we just want a free camera. All right, we'll have a lottery at halftime to see who gets to keep that. Oh, there we go. I didn't realize I could do that. You learn something new every day, right? But what Somoza wanted was a canal built. Remember, they were talking about that in the 1890s? Somoza says, look, we still need a canal. Just think what a canal will do for us, right? And so Franklin Roosevelt, now this is the policy of the good neighbor, right? So FDR has to be a good neighbor. So instead of building a canal, because he just doesn't really need another one, he constructs an Interoceanic Highway. So the United States goes down to Nicaragua and helps them build a highway that goes from the Caribbean all the way to the Pacific, okay? And PanAmerican Highway. And Samosa takes advantage of that. He uses it to great effect. He uses it especially to transport his military units. And why would these military units be transported? To fight, to fight wars? No. What would they be doing? What was the main purpose of Somoza's military, Somoza's National Guard? To keep down the people, right. And so American development actually becomes a way for Somoza to further suppress his people. And Nicaragua, like the Dominican Republic, has stories throughout this entire period of people disappearing, labor leaders, socialists, human rights activists being attacked, being imprisoned, being massacred, village massacres. It's unfortunately a very familiar story. Right? And so between, from the 1930s to 1979, as in these other places, the United States underwrote the Somoza dictatorship. His officers, I believe by 1979, every general in the Guard had trained in the United States, most at the School of the Americas, maybe all of them at the School of the Americas, which was set up in the 60s to train Latin American military. They had all trained at some American institution. The level of American economic support for Nicaragua was great. The U.S. always supported Nicaragua internationally. They gave them a great deal of money, military equipment. All of these countries, when they actually suppress the people, are doing it with American weapons and American technology. American batons, American tasers, American guns, American infantry, you name it. American artillery, you name it. So when the Guardia comes, as far as the Nicaraguans are concerned, they're just hired thugs who actually work for the U.S. And I mean, in a sense, in the law, if you trace it back, the U.S. is paying the bills. They are paying for this repression. Yeah.
I think the military academy always had a certain number of students assigned for each one of those countries.
Yeah. There have always been these, kind of transfer programs and whatnot. And then I can't remember when the School of the Americas was actually developed at Fort Benning, which is a new name, but it's still around today. I believe that was part of the Kennedy program. And that was specifically, the School of the Americas specifically was for Latin American military leaders. If you look at all, the top 10 dictator torturers of the last so many years, every single one of them has been a graduate of the School of the Americas. Somoza's people all were. The guy from Peru a few years ago, Vladimir Montesinos, was a product of the School of the Americas. I mean, if you look at the guys, who are legendary throughout Latin America for torture and brutality, they were all American trained, and that's not by coincidence. It's kind of funny, today there's this controversy over torture at Abu Ghraib and other places in Iraq. And if you study Latin America, this is nothing new at all. I mean, there were torture manuals which were very explicit. Later on, if I remind me, there's actually a 19-page CIA assassination manual that they put together in the 50s on literally how to assassinate troublemakers in Latin America.
A colored picture book?
Yeah, it was. They've had stuff like that. In the 80s they had that, where, there was a terror manual in the 80s, it was like a color book. It was like a cartoon book, that kind of thing, yeah. So, again, for Latin America, this isn't really a complicated, nuanced issue. It's pretty clear-cut. The Yankees are paying people to kill us. The machos are coming. They will burn down our houses, right? And we can sit here and say, but no, I mean, actually, that's pretty much on target. So, again, one man's terrorism is somebody else's something else, but for the Nicaraguans, this is clearly terror. And yeah.
Is this the blueprint of what's going on in Haiti with the rebel activists?
Yeah, I was actually going to talk about the history of Haiti next, but Haiti's probably the best example of all of these. I mean, poor Haiti, right? I mean, it's just the poorest, most oppressed place in the world in a lot of ways. But the U.S. has had incredible influence over Haiti forever. And that's actually was my segue into the next one. I want to talk about Haiti. The U.S. began to occupy Haiti in 1915, and I told you this before. The National City Bank of New York owned the Haitian National Bank. Wall Street owned the Haitian National Treasury. I mean, think about that. A private bank owns the national treasury of another country. That's control. That's power. I mean, and even, Capone couldn't do that, Tony Soprano can't do that. The United States, as with Nicaragua, was deeply involved. Now, part of this, I'm talking about this in really kind of stark ways. The U.S. is supporting these horrible regimes, and they're building up the Guardia, and they're helping people get killed, and so forth. But there's a flip side to that. I mentioned this, I think, in the first class, where the U.S. actually does believe to some extent in modernization and development, because ultimately, the goal in these places would be to develop a society that can survive on its own, ultimately to become consumers, to become part of the marketplace. So at the same time that the U.S. is supporting the Guardia in maintaining these means of repression, it's building highways and hospitals and schools and railways and things like that. But that kind of development never seeps down to the people. It's generally controlled at the very top level and often by American capital. So Haiti remains, to this day, arguably the poorest place, the most underdeveloped place in the world. In the mid-60s, not that long ago, 40 years ago, in the mid-60s, the life expectancy in Haiti was 35 years old. That was the life expectancy for all of Haiti. It's probably about 50 today. And the literacy rate was about 10%. If you look at Haiti in the 90s or today, it is still incredibly sordid. I mean, no plumbing. I mean, literally garbage in the streets, pigs rooting in the garbage. It's just really horrific. Yeah.
Maybe now, if you have one car, even if it doesn't work,
Oh, yeah, having an automobile. I mean, this is really, like a few years back, Haiti got a contract, some of the American baseball sporting manufacturers moved down there to make baseballs. I mean, this was like development for Haiti. And what they would do is pay these they would hire these Haitian workers, but put them on 6-week probationary periods. They wouldn't get paid for 6 weeks. They'd make baseballs, and then 6 weeks, like 5 weeks and 6 days in, they'd be fired. And so they wouldn't get paid, and then you just hire more people on a probationary period. This is kind of, typical of the way the U.S. has kind of developed that. Yeah?
You were saying Nicaragua, they developed Nicaragua, but they did not develop Haiti?
Well, they didn't develop any of these places. What they did is send money for projects. What they would do is say, we're going to give you money to build a hospital or build a school or whatever. That money went to the central government. Whoever it was took out their cut of it, and then they contracted an American company to come down there and build it. All right? So this is essentially a welfare program, Instead of me giving the money directly, I send it to Haiti, they contract here, they take their cut. Right? When these things are built, they don't create any kind of economic development. They're not used to create a middle class. They're not used to create any kind of a democratic society. They're basically ways to line the pockets of people's cronies. So you can build a highway, but what good's it do when you're not producing anything? There's no manufacturing. So you have a highway, but you're not selling any goods. So the highway, kind of like in Nicaragua, is used for the army, the guard, to travel on.
As far as infrastructure goes,
Virtually none. Virtually none.
So all that money was just
And that's the point.
basically squandered.
Yeah, I mean, the money isn't going for infrastructure. I mean, a highway is infrastructure, right? But you need commercial development along that highway. That doesn't happen. I mean, the roads generally are used for the government, by the government, to maintain its own control, its own power. There is no industry in Haiti. Some sugar,
What was the U.S. methods of intervention in Haiti after the Haitians, I know they helped the French? How did the U.S. come in to get in Haiti?
In the 1800s?
Or I know just between the period when the French were out of Haiti and the U.S. coming in.
I'll be quick with this. You know a little bit about the Haitian background. Haiti was actually a French colony, first slave rebellion, Toussaint Louverture, so it becomes a black republic, which blows people away, the black Jacobins. And that was in 1803, I think. Between 1803 and 1840s, the U.S. did not recognize Haiti. It did not even acknowledge that had happened. So finally, in the 1840s, the U.S. recognizes Haiti, and part of the idea there is maybe we can incorporate it into this kind of Caribbean empire. The U.S. had always taken this incredibly paternal and imperial approach toward the Haitians. They got involved simply because they were so close. I mean, it was just a matter of the Monroe Doctrine and everything else. What really gets the U.S. involved in Haiti at the turn of the century is, as I think I mentioned this a couple of weeks ago, Germany and France were actually had owned shares in the Haitian National Bank. So it's not really Haiti so much as we don't want the Germans and the French to be anywhere on the continent. We don't want them investing, even if it is a backward place, a small place like Haiti. There's a lot of new literature on Haiti which suggests the racial element is very important too. It is a black republic, and the Americans with their racial attitudes will, that'll be a motivating factor in the treatment they have. I told you the famous William Jennings Bryan story when he walks out of this meeting in 1915 and he turns and he says, "Niggers speaking French, don't that beat all?" So there's this real ignorance and this real paternalism that's really prevalent among the Americans too. So, I mean, in addition to that, Haiti has this kind of cultural imagery. I mean, when you think of Haiti, voodoo and stuff like that, zombies, This is kind of Hollywood would do movies and, in the Caribbean, and it would be like, the most ugly racial stereotypes, black people doing voodoo with zombies and all this kind of stuff. So this is kind of the typical American view of that. If you look at the official reports, they often refer to Haitians as niggers. I mean, these aren't like, conversations, whispered conversations. These are reports where people come home and say, yeah, we were in Haiti with all the niggers. So this is the kind of racial contempt that's really prevalent too. So it's really, I mean, the classic, kind of imperial paternal approach toward a group of people who you really have pretty much racial contempt for. There isn't much infrastructure in Haiti, but what is built actually contributes to the problem because it's built with corvée labor. Anybody ever heard that term before, corvée? Corvée labor? You ever take European history? What you do is you create a system in which people can't pay their taxes, can't meet their civic obligations. So if you can't pay your taxes, what do? You don't send them to jail, you make them work. Corvée labor basically is forced labor. It's not unlike it's virtual slavery, right? You can't pay your taxes, you're going to build a road for me, that kind of thing. Well, the people doing corvée labor don't like it, do they? Because they're basically enslaved. They're not getting paid. They're doing this to work off an obligation that they never really should have had to begin with. So then this starts as soon as the occupation begins in the 19-teens. And the Haitians start to resist, so much so that in 1919 there was a major insurrection of the Haitians, and the U.S. Marines came in, and in order to quell it, killed over 2,000 Haitians. The Marines came in and simply started gunning people down, right? Just kind of massive, it was a massacre, all right? This is the way that the U.S. maintained authority and control. This wasn't even the Guard they had, this was the U.S. Marines itself. Now, again, this doesn't look good. This creates a bad relationship, right? When the Marines are there gunning down Haitians in the street. So the U.S., as it's done elsewhere, will establish a National Guard. In Haiti, it's called the Garde de Haiti. Garde de Haiti, I don't have a French accent, obviously. The Garde de Haiti. The Haitian Guard is there, like these other places, to crush subversives, or to crush insurrection, or to crush revolution, whichever buzzword you want to use. Ironically, the Guardsmen were actually mostly American. There were some Haitians in it, but there were a lot of Americans. They were commanded by an American major named Smedley Butler. Now later on, I'm going to speak in very positive terms about Smedley Butler, but when Butler got started, he was basically a henchman. He was a Marine general. And Smedley Butler was talking about these Haitians in the Guard, and he said, I'm going to use my little chocolate soldiers to make a real and happy nation out of this bloody, crazy Garden of Eden. So you can kind of see the imagery, the Garden of Eden, right? Child, the garden, that kind of thing. And the racial contempt, my little chocolate soldiers. So this is the way the U.S. Deals with that. The Guard runs Haiti for years. Later in the 1960s to almost the present, the Guard would be replaced by kind of a paramilitary group called the Tonton Macoutes. And the Tontons would go around just committing the worst kinds of atrocities, all with American support. So Haiti also fits into this framework of using the Guard and using American business to control a country. But when need be, you'll send the Marines out, you'll drop you'll drop bombs from the air on a village, or you'll just simply kill 2,000 people to send them a message. And that's the real point of the terror and the repression, is to send them a message. Don't do this, you could be next. It's kind of it's the same idea that planters would use if a slave was rebellious. They would cut his head off and put it on a stick in the middle of the plantation. And the message there is, you're next if you act up. So this is the idea behind these tactics in Latin America as well. Okay, Cuba. Yeah.
Before we move on from
Yeah.
Haiti, what was from 1803 to whenever we started getting into there, what was their government like? Or were they well ruled, or was it a full
It had very little, if any, outside investment. Incredibly poor, isolated. It was a mess. It was.
Is that just from pissing the French off, or?
Oh yeah, I mean, like I said, the U.S. didn't even recognize Haiti for almost 50 years. It was almost impossible to get outside capital. Ultimately, when they do, it's the French, I mean, obviously still have this kind of cultural attachment. But Germany, I think, is really the threat, because the Germans in the late 19th and early 20th century begin investing in the Western Hemisphere. And this is finally what wakes the Americans up. Other than that, they don't really care. But they don't want the Germans coming in. And Germany will do this prior to World War I and World War II, which will raise, alarm bells for the U.S. We don't want the Germans in our hemisphere. We don't want the British in our hemisphere either. We're not happy about the French, but especially the Germans. So it's when Germany starts to invest in the French banking system that the U.S. really gets more interested. But no, Haiti was never well ruled. It was incredibly poor. No, it is, a model for impoverishment and repression. Cuba. When we last left Cuba, they had the Platt Amendment, which basically said the U.S. could kind of go in anytime it wanted and do whatever it wanted. And so the U.S. has, even though not a formal colony, clear hegemony in Cuba. And investments are very high there. Investments in sugar in Cuba are $1.5 billion by 1929. And again, the exchange rate was probably 8 or 9 to 1. So 1.5 billion is a significant amount of money. It was the second heaviest investments after Mexico for the U.S. The U.S. also controlled Cuba's banking and utilities industries. In Cuba, the U.S. backed a dictator named Gerardo Machado. I think, do I have that on there? Yeah, Machado. In the 1920s and early 30s, Machado admired Mussolini. So this is kind of what his political ideology was, very brutal, and he provoked resistance. Now, there had always been problems in Cuba because from the time the Americans got rid of the Spanish and didn't leave, there were a large number of Cubans who wanted them out and who wouldn't support the U.S. or support any of the politicians that the U.S. put in power, like Machado. Roosevelt understands that this is a problem. Now, the good neighbor policy says we don't intervene, but at the same time, Roosevelt understands that Machado is a bad guy, and it would be so much better if the U.S. could have somebody in power who it could work with so that it wouldn't have this ugly stain of having to support this really brutal guy, Gerardo Machado. Roosevelt does send warships to Cuba to support Machado, who is under attack internally, but he doesn't want to actually get rid of him. Well, Machado is eventually overthrown by the people of Cuba. And Roosevelt and the Americans cannot control the aftermath of that. Roosevelt sent in one of his diplomats, a man named Sumner Welles. And the Cubans had put a new government in power led by Ramon Grau San Martin. And San Martin was a reformist. The spacing got kind of screwed up here. But Grau San Martin was a reformist. He wanted to institute land reform and really kind of change the dynamic. And also, he was not on the same kind of terms with American businessmen that Machado and others had been. So the Americans immediately, what do? Do they intervene to get rid of Grau San Martin? No. This is the good neighbor policy, right? The policy of the good neighbor. So what does the good neighbor do? It stops all loans to Cuba, and it refuses to buy Cuban sugar. So that's not intervention, is it? We're not sending the Marines in to overthrow Grau San Martin. But when you stop loans and you stop the sugar trade, what's the net effect? What happens to Grau San Martin? What do you think? He's toppled. He's toppled, right? Because the U.S. uses its power. We will replace dollars with bullets. So the U.S. uses its dollars to get rid of Grau San Martin. The army overthrows him. He had not even been in power for a year in a coup led by Fulgencio Batista. Batista uttered the famous words at that time. He had taken over. There was uprising. The peasants who loved Grau San Martin because Grau San Martin had given them land, right? He had promised agricultural reform, and in barely a year, not even a year, he had actually begun a process of agricultural reform. So when Batista overthrows Grau San Martin, the peasants are furious, and Batista says, get to work. There will be a harvest or there will be blood. Batista is supported by the United States for the next 26 years. Fulgencio Batista, in a sense, was the poster boy for Latin American dictators, along with Samosa and Trujillo and Duvalier and Haiti, in the Caribbean. All right. When does Batista finally leave power? January 1st, 1959. Castro overthrows him. Right. And again, in that period, Batista was repressive and brutal. The army was supported by the Americans, funded and armed by the Americans, and American businessmen had huge investments, huge stakes in Cuba, especially in what industries? Sugar, hotels, entertainment, gambling, right? You ever see The Godfather? Second Godfather? I mean, that's actually pretty much accurately correct, the scenes in Cuba where Michael Corleone was going down there to cut deals. I mean, the American gangsters had a great time in Cuba. It was the playhouse for Americans. They would head down to Cuba. It would be like, Vegas wasn't really anything yet. So people would go to Havana, and this is where you went if you wanted to gamble or to, live it up. So the Americans had a huge stake in Cuba. Cuba is interesting because it was really the most developed of these countries. It was actually had a sugar industry, had a history of industrialization. So Cuba should not have been poor, but the disparity between those who controlled the wealth and power and the masses of people was really great. So Castro, it wasn't difficult for him to actually, I mean, the revolution is, it's very difficult, but it's bloody. I mean, there are a lot of conflict there, but at the same time, if you look at it, I mean, Castro actually fairly rapidly takes over in Cuba once he begins to attack Batista. All right. The final kind of case study is going to be Mexico. Right, and we talked about the Mexican Revolution and how the Americans, Woodrow Wilson, made sure that the right guys, the right side, won the Mexican Revolution. However, at the same time, in 1917, when Carranza takes over, Mexico writes a constitution that really pisses off the Americans because it says that all land and water and subsoil resources belong to Mexicans. Now, subsoil resources, what's that? Oil. That's all you need to know, right? So Mexico's saying, this oil is ours. Now, the United States had huge investments in Mexico, the biggest in the entire hemisphere. So the United States are quite upset. And the U.S. refuses to recognize the Carranza government until 1923, when the Mexicans agree that the pre-1917 American rights would be respected. The United States owns over 60% of Mexico's oil industry. So what the Mexicans are saying is, you can keep that. We can't get it back from you. In addition to that, the Mexicans say that all agricultural lands will be compensated. So that if Mexico appropriates American agricultural land, they will be compensated. As I said, I'm not sure what year, what time period, but the biggest landholder in both in Cuba, in Mexico, and in Texas was Richard Kleiberg, the guy who owns the King Ranch, was also the biggest landholder in Mexico and Cuba. So Americans own a majority of Mexican agricultural land, as well as over 60% of Mexico's oil. All right. Now, the U.S. doesn't intervene in Mexico, and there will be several reasons for that. One of them, it's important to note, though, is that at the same time that the Mexican oil industry is developing, so is Venezuela's. And Venezuela will ultimately outproduce Mexico, and the U.S. has access to that. The U.S. controls Venezuelan oil, in a sense, in the same way it does Mexican. And Venezuela, they called the people who ran the oil industry the oligarchy, the oligarchs. And the U.S., because it has a steady supply of oil coming in from Venezuela, and keep in mind, American oil needs aren't that great in the 20s and 30s, so it's, the domestic market basically can be accommodated from sources at home. Texas and, Pennsylvania is the first place they have oil, places like that, right? And then when you have Venezuela in the picture, you don't have any kind of oil crisis looming on the horizon. And there's very little Mideast oil, right, at this time. So, in the late 1920s, then, the United States, going slow, gets another agreement with the Mexicans, which confirms the pre-1917 ownership. So even though Mexico claims all these subsoil resources, what they do is essentially grandfather in the American oil ownership, so it's not really threatened. In 1938, though, all hell breaks loose. There's a new president in Mexico, Lázaro Cárdenas. If any of you follow Mexico politics, you've probably heard of a guy who ran for president and was mayor of Mexico City recently, named Cuauhtémoc Cárdenas. That's his son. Cardenas was very, very old when he had his son Cuauhtémoc. Cardenas was a real reformist, and in 1938 Cardenas went over the edge and he expropriated all foreign oil holdings. You know what expropriation is? It's when you actually take it. You actually take it, but you have to compensate them for it, right? Cardenas says, this is our oil, these subsoil oil rights belong to us, we will take it, all right? So this isn't confirming pre-1917 ownership. It says, no, you don't own it any longer. The Mexican government now owns it, but we will reimburse you for your investment. Cardenas said, I will burn the oil fields to the ground rather than sacrifice our national honor, all right? Now, the ambassador to Mexico was a man named Josephus Daniels, and he believed that the best approach would be to adhere to the good neighbor policy, to be conciliatory. Daniels, however, admits that, this is Josephus Daniels, the American ambassador to Mexico City, saying, the oil and other big interests have no sympathy with the good neighbor policy. They go to bed every night wishing that Porfirio Diaz were back in power and that we carried the big stick and we had Marines ready to land at their beck and call. How do businessmen want to conduct U.S. policy in Latin America? Intervention, Monroe Doctrine, dealing with, strong men like Diaz. Clearly they would prefer Diaz to Cardenas any day. The point here, and what Roosevelt understands that a lot of these businessmen don't, is that this kind of liberal empire ultimately is far more effective. And we're going to talk a lot more about this. What Roosevelt is trying to do is establish the kind of thing that Wilson established. Roosevelt comes out of the Wilsonian tradition. This is liberal empire. This isn't empire where you go in and you send the Marines in and you massacre people. That's a mistake, right? Why? It invokes opposition to you. It doesn't create a modern society. If you have to use constant repression to keep the people suppressed, to keep them subdued, that's not a modern society. A modern society is built not on repression but on and freedom means trade, commerce. Freedom, just another word for nothing left to lose, right? A modern society is built on commerce, not on repression, all right? And this is what Roosevelt and people like Josephus Daniels understand, and a lot of these businessmen don't. Yeah, we can send the Marines in. We could create a bloodbath throughout all of Mexico. But ultimately, does that help create or develop Mexican society? Does it create democracy? Does it create modernity? Does it develop Mexico? Of course not. We have to deal with them on their terms because, some of them think they're as good as we are, and some of them are, so let's give them a chance. Right? This is the point of liberal developmentalism. You ever heard that term before, liberal developmentalism? You've been doing your reading. Right? Liberal developmentalism. Okay? The idea there is to create free institutions and free markets. All right? That's why what you see happening in Iraq today is really a departure from American empire. And that's why it's running into so much opposition. All right? What they're trying to do is install and in place and impose American institutions and American power, whereas, that's always going to invite opposition in ways that, what did Taft say? We will replace bullets with dollars. All right? So this is what Daniel says. The businessmen want to do it the old way, but we can't do that anymore. Roosevelt kind of understands and more or less agrees with Daniel's point. He's not going to send the troops in. He does use economic coercion, however. The Americans reduced their purchases of Mexican silver. American oil companies refused to sell oil equipment to Mexico. Shipping firms refused to carry Mexican oil. Oil companies and the media started to spread propaganda that Cardenas was actually trying to create. He was like Stalin. He was trying to create this horrible place in Mexico. He was a Stalinist, right? What did Cardenas do? Did he back down? Did he buckle? He started selling oil, too. Now, what would it really piss off the U.S.? Who would you sell oil to if you want to piss off the U.S.? Germany? Not Russia, not the Soviet Union. They have plenty of their own. Japan, Germany, and Italy. Cardenas starts selling oil to the enemy in the late 30s, right? The United States, he basically calls their bluff, right? FDR has to settle. The talks are tough, but in 1941 they finally get a deal. The United States conceded, Mexico won, the U.S. conceded that Mexico owned its own raw materials. Mexico did pay the oil companies and other Americans for expropriated properties. And the Export-Import Bank, which was an American bank to develop foreign commerce, gave Mexico a loan of $30 million. Because of the good neighbor policy, the U.S. abandoned intervention. Ultimately, did it hurt them? No. The U.S. continued to have incredible power over Mexico. Remember what Diaz said, pity poor Mexico, we're so far from God and so close to the United States. So again, when we talk about globalization and trade, this is the point. Globalization necessarily has to be a liberal process, right? Globalization isn't taking place in Haiti, right? Mexico stood up to the U.S., controlled its own subsoil resources, and was able to develop. Haiti, which was simply acted upon by the U.S., never was able to. Yeah.
After U.S. concedes, I forget the guy that owned the King Ranch or whatever, does he lose all that land?
I'm not sure in his case specifically what the deal was. Americans still have a lot of land ownership. I don't really know specifically, what they were. I mean, basically, one way, and I'm not sure about Mexico, I'm not going to speak with any authority about that, but one way to often circumvent these kinds of laws is to go there and set up joint partnerships with Mexican firms, right? So, well, that does happen in Mexico. So you have Coca-Cola. I mean, the president of Mexico today was president of Mexico's Coca-Cola operations, Vicente Fox, right? So what you do is you go down there and you set up Coca-Cola Mexico, McDonald's France, whatever, and so you operate that way. So it's basically a subsidiary, but it's adheres to these national ownership laws. So I'm not really sure in terms of Clyburg. I can look that up, but the U.S. was not by any means cut out of Mexico. I mean, today we know that, right? I mean, when Mexico has a major currency crisis, what do? The U.S. bails them out, right? All right. So all of this is happening, and then amid all this in the late 30s, you have a war on the horizon. And this is also going to affect American policy there. In the period, well, really throughout the entire 20th century, the U.S. had often talked about PanAmericanism. What does that term mean? Pan anything, but PanAmericanism. The whole thing, right, across these borders. So the idea there is that we are all in the same hemisphere. We have common interests and common values. We need to work together. But the Americans and the Latin Americans see Pan-Americanism very differently, all right? For the U.S., Pan-Americanism means continued hegemony, and for Latin Americans, or for at least a large segment of Latin America, it means sovereignty. It means self-determination. So these are quite different. Periodically, the nations of Latin America would meet every 5 years, and the U.S. would generally go to these Pan-American meetings and basically say what was going on. But in 1928, at a meeting in Havana, Cuba, a delegate from El Salvador stood up and he said something remarkable. He made a proposal that said, no state has the right to intervene in the internal affairs of another. No state has the right to intervene in the internal affairs of another. Now, on the surface, that sounds like sovereignty or self-determination, but it's truly wild, right? What's going on in El Salvador? There's actually a movement there led by, it's kind of a Sandino figure in El Salvador named Farabundo Martí. And Farabundo Martí was leading a rebellion to overthrow the state there, and the U.S. was helping crush the Salvadoran movement just as the same way it was Sandino in Nicaragua. So this delegate from El Salvador, doesn't matter where he's from, says, no state has the right to intervene in the internal affairs of another state. And what do you think the Americans think of that? Oh, they don't like it, right? But isn't that what the Monroe Doctrine said? But now what they're doing is turning it on its head and trying to make it apply to the U.S. as well. Because the U.S. is saying, well, Europe has to stay out. They have no right to intervene in Latin America. And what the Latin Americans are saying is, yeah, you don't have the right to intervene against us either. The U.S. tries to table it. The Salvadoran delegate hangs tough and makes the Secretary of State, Charles Everett Hughes, defend America's policy in Latin America. And Hughes finally defends what he calls interposition of a temporary character. Basically meaning it's okay if we send the Marines in to clean things up and then we leave, right? That's okay. Interposition of a temporary character. The U.S. finally does force this issue to be tabled, but it's clear that there is an incredible amount of resentment against the U.S. You know, Americans are kind of slow to get it. You know, oh my God, they don't like us here? You know, how ungrateful. Why do they hate us? That kind of thing. This is the kind of rhetoric you would hear at the time. After all we've done for them, they treat us like this. 5 years later, Franklin Roosevelt is in power with a new policy, the good neighbor policy, right? And the Latin American countries meet, this time in Montevideo, Uruguay. And the Salvadoran Resolution is once again introduced. This time, Roosevelt's people vote for it, but they also introduce a reservation, a qualification to it that says, we have the right to intervene by the laws of nations as generally recognized and accepted. So even though Roosevelt votes for this, you know, Salvadoran proposal that says we don't have the right to intervene, what he's saying is, in fact, is yeah, we do, okay, which is just kind of a recognition of power. But it goes over a lot easier. Roosevelt had a certain style about him that really covered up a lot of, I mean, a good example is, you ever hear the Bonus March? A bunch of vets, there's a huge depression in the U.S. in the 20s, right? And a bunch of veterans from World War I are broke, and they wanted their bonus. They were promised that 20 years after serving in the Army, they would get a nice bonus, you know, a pension. And they wanted it early because there was a depression and they were all broke. And Hoover says, well, I can't. You're not supposed to get it for 20 years. And they said, but we're broke now. Actually, from an economic standpoint, it would have been a good idea because these guys would have taken the money and spent it, thereby helping the economy get reinvigorated. But Hoover didn't see things that way. He just said, that'll bust the budget. We'll have a deficit because we'll have to pay them money, you know. So anyway, he doesn't do it. So a bunch of these World War I veterans get together and they form something called the Bonus Army or the Pension Army. And they actually march on Washington, D.C. Thousands of them. These are guys who had served in World War I. They have their uniforms on. And they get to a place in D.C. called Anacostia Flats. It's kind of where RFK Stadium was. I think it's gone now. And what does Hoover do to the Bonus Army? World War I vets. What's he do? He sends the Army out to wipe them out. MacArthur and Patton wipe out their guys from World War I, the guys they had fought with in World War I, right? It's ugly. A year later, Roosevelt's in power. The Bonus Army comes back. What happens? What does Roosevelt do? Who does he send out? He sends out his wife with tea and cookies, right? And everyone says, oh, how sweet. Did he get the bonus? No. They ultimately did get it. But the point was, he just had kind of a sense that this is the way to do things. So instead of saying to the Salvadorans, absolutely not, you know, Roosevelt says, oh yeah, we'll vote for it, and then we'll change it so that it doesn't mean anything. Things change a lot from 1933 on. At that point, the war in Europe starts to define everything. And remember what I said, what was Cardenas' ultimate trump card? Selling oil to the Germans, the Japanese, and the Italians. As the Axis, as these powers become more aggressive, then the threat to all of Latin America becomes greater. And even if the Latin Americans have resentment against the United States, they also know that who's going to protect them? The U.S. is. So basically, at the next meeting in 1938, these countries all get together and pledge to unite together to resist foreign intervention, all right? Because Germany clearly had ambitions in the region. Germany, you know the Zimmermann telegram. Germany was often playing the kind of Latin American card, right? So Latin America joins the fight against the Axis powers, but continues to harbor anti-American sentiments and will for some time thereafter. All right. So, but as we build up to World War II, you can see that clearly there is a history now of animosity, of resentment in the Americas between the Latin Americans and the U.S. And when we get to like the 60s and the 70s, and we'll start talking about Cuba and Nicaragua and all this kind of stuff, you know where it comes from. The Americans, again, were kind of like, America leaves the world in shock. Wow, they don't like us. Well, there's clearly a history there. And even the good neighbor policy simply changed the form, not the goals, not the outcomes. All right? Any questions on that stuff? All right. We're going to talk now about, start talking about World War II. And as I said, there's just so much we could do with this. I'm going to kind of take fragments of it, and hopefully it won't be too disjointed. All right? Any questions on any of this up to this point? All right, we'll try to do as much of World War II as we can. Then we'll get into the fun stuff. It makes it sound like this isn't fun, but the Cold War and everything, from that point on, I think it's stuff you're far more familiar with. All right? But we're going to start by talking about Europe in the 30s, and we shall proceed, hopefully quickly, from there. Last week I talked about American attempts to kind of help Germany recover. And what was the point of getting Germany to recover? Was it out of the goodness of their heart? Why did the U.S. want Germany to recover from World War I? Markets, to create this kind of economic, this is liberalism, global stability, economic stability. And so the Dawes Plan and the Young Plan were part of that. In addition to that, the German government in the late 1920s under a man named Gustav Stresemann took action that actually helped economic recovery. However, the World Depression hits in the late 1920s, in 1929, and the two countries affected the worst by the global depression of the 20s and 30s were the United States and Germany. In Germany, depression goes from 1.3 million to 6 million. In the U.S., remember, it went from like 1.5 million to about 12 million.
How was it that France and Britain were
Good question.
much of an answer?
Well, I no, it's basically, I don't know. Why? I mean, first of all, France and Britain did suffer from the Depression. Why was it worse in the U.S. and Germany than in France and Britain?
Since the payments went from the U.S., or the loans went from the U.S. to Germany, and then from there, from Germany, with a little bit taken out, went back to Britain and France, and then back to the U.S., why they weren't hit just as hard as harder.
Was it because we were funding?
Well, actually, I think it's probably because Britain and France maintained gold convertibility at a level that the U.S. and I don't know about I don't know if Germany was on the gold standard or not. What Britain did, I mean, Britain's policy was to maintain gold convertibility, which meant that currency would remain stable. That may have been why you had a stable currency. What happens in the 30s is you have this rash. I mean, there is, to some extent, I do know a little bit about it, and it is a mouthful. One of the real problems of the 30s was that there becomes a rush of currency convertibility. As the economy goes down, the various countries of Europe start to readjust their currencies, which basically means they inflate them, right? Right? The British and I don't think did that. I think they maintained a stable currency. Britain does have high unemployment as a result of the Depression, I know that. And when I suggest that the Americans and British got it the worst, that doesn't by any means that Britain and France got off easy. I don't think it was as bad. In addition to that, they probably had, well, I mean, Britain has the empire. Britain has a guaranteed, Britain and France both have guaranteed markets.
So didn't a closed system help them quite a bit?
Yeah, that's my point. I think they have guaranteed imperial markets, the imperial preference system. So they don't lose markets in the same way that the free trade countries do. And keep in mind, I mean, the U.S. is heavily dependent on them. So anything that happens there is going to be, kind of compounded when it comes back across the Atlantic. So did I rally enough to kind of sound like I know what I'm talking about? Yeah. I faked it well, right? So within Germany, then, unemployment is a major issue, and the right wing is able to exploit this. In elections in 1930, the National Socialist Party, the Nazi Party, wins big. Their membership in Parliament rises from 15 to well over 100. And from that point on, from late 1930 on, the big issue in German politics is the Nazis. Will the Nazis come to power? A new chancellor in Germany is put into place in 1930 named Heinrich Brüning. He is a militarist. He doesn't like the French. He doesn't like Versailles. Situation is worsening. In the 30s, the Nazis are taking advantage of this. Look at what happened as a result of Versailles. Look at what they did to us. The Versailles settlement is killing us. Look at what the socialists have done to us. Look at what the communists have done. So the communists the Nazis are on the move. Who are the two biggest enemies? Who are the two kind of scapegoats? The two, bête noire of the Nazis? Who are the two groups that they blame everything on?
That the Nazis blame?
Yeah, the Nazis blame everything. The Jews? and communist, which are basically the same, right? Because Bolshevism was often equated with Judaism. So Hitler and the Nazis are saying, it's the Jews, it's the communists, it's the Jews, it's the communists, right? And so people, listen to that. They are actually gaining a following. In 1932, there are elections. Hitler runs for president. He's defeated by an older German statesman named Paul von Hindenburg. Von Hindenburg dismisses the Chancellor, Heinrich Brüning, which is kind of a blow to the right. So the nationalists, the extremists, the Nazis grow stronger and more vocal. They're pissed off at Hindenburg now. The military in Germany is increasingly coming under Nazi influence. Hindenburg is, not, he's a militarist himself. So he starts to cooperate with the National Socialists, with the Nazis. And the Nazi vote actually went down by late 1932. Hindenburg names a new chancellor, and this is detail you don't really need to know, I'm just kind of going through it quickly. But Hitler names a new chancellor named Franz von Papen, and Franz von Papen thinks that the Nazis have to move quick. The time that, they may be losing their chances. So von Papen names Adolf Hitler as chancellor and brings other Nazis into the German cabinet, and in January of 1933, over the reservations of Paul von Hindenburg. Hindenburg didn't want Hitler, but Hitler comes in and becomes chancellor in January of 33. By this time, German politics was polarized. There was no middle. So on the far left, you had kind of the Spartacists and the communists, and then on the right, you had the Nazis and the militarists. The Nazis were able to exploit that. The people, the landholders and the industrialists supported the Nazis. They had a great deal of support from the industrial classes, from the corporate classes, from the landholder classes, from the wealthy. A lot of small town people and rural people supported the Nazis because they invoked this sense of kind of a mythical past, you remember how Reagan used to talk about the city on the hill, I'll get in trouble for this views, but there's a lot, and if you look at the Reagan rhetoric in 1980, it really does borrow heavily from the kind of things that Hitler was saying, obviously without genocides and all that kind of stuff, or without the kind of genocides that the Nazis had and all that stuff. If you go to Guatemala, you'll get a different story. But it really does, yeah, I know, I'm digging it. When you're in a hole, you're supposed to quit digging. So what you see then is this appeal to this mythical past, right? And in addition to that, poor people are the ones who lose their jobs, right? Poor people are the ones who have to pay more for food. So, yeah.
Nazi genocide?
I'm talking about the rhetoric of Reagan.
But
Yeah.
you said it didn't equate necessarily to the genocide. What about Reagan? I hear a lot of people, he was president in the 80s.
Yeah.
The invention of AIDS and crack in the black community.
There's a lot of things you could do with that. In fact, when they said you're digging a hole, when I mentioned Guatemala, Guatemala, which is a very small country, over 250,000 people were killed, and they were Mayan Indian. It was basically genocidal. So people throw that phrase around way too easily. Genocide should be reserved for something big. I think it demeans it. Clearly what World War II was clearly a genocide. Cambodia was clearly a genocide. I think the Middle Passage in slavery and the treatment of Native Americans was genocidal. But we have to be careful about using it just casually. That's my point. There actually, we could talk about this later, but there actually is, legally, it is an attack on a specific group, a religious group or an ethnic group. It's a defined thing. It's not just being nasty to a lot of people. I think we're too casual about it. Actually, I think in Guatemala that would qualify. I was saying something. I wasn't trying to be flip. I really entered into a discussion I shouldn't have, and we should probably try to rewind this and get it edited, right? But that's not going to happen, so I'll just get more hate mail. At any rate, It did, but my point was that this isn't something that's endemic. I mean, when you're going through a crisis situation like that, you often harken back on this idyllic past. Remember, things were so much better back in the old days, before the socialists, before the Jews, before this, before that. And it really has an appeal, especially to people who don't have, kind of the same outlook or the same ideology that the ruling class does. So, and the Nazis are able to benefit from that. So Hitler takes over in 1933 and immediately takes on this kind of aggressive nature. On the outline it says the rise of Hitler and Mussolini. We talked about Mussolini the other day. No point to go over that again, and you should remember that. Hitler takes over and immediately you start to see this kind of aggressive nature. Now, one thing that's important to keep in mind as we go through this, because Hitler's going to do this and Hitler's going to do that, and we now know Hitler is this horrible evil monster, right? It's really easy to look upon him, and we know everything he did, and oh my God, he's this, the worst guy ever, right? We all know that now. But Adolf Hitler wasn't Adolf Hitler yet at that point, This is like, Elvis before 1955. He wasn't really Hitler, right? He wasn't really Elvis. At the time, Hitler is this right-wing militarist saying that Germany needs to be great, Germany needs to have an empire, all ethnic Germans need to be under German control, and the Jews and the communists are to blame, right? Hitler's not killing millions of Jews. Hitler doesn't have death camps. He hasn't gone to war against the world yet. So people say, what's new? I mean, he doesn't sound that extreme. He's not that extreme. This is a typical German power-oriented politician, all right? He's blaming the Jews. You ever read Merchant of Venice? Anybody ever read Merchant of Venice? You familiar with that? It's Shakespeare. Who's he? That's Merchant. Who are the protagonists in this? Remember the famous soliloquy, "If you prick us, do you not bleed"? Who's saying that? A Jewish merchant. This is in the early 1600s, right? This attack on Jews is nothing new. Hitler's not the first European politician to say, it's the Jews to blame. They control the money supply. This is typical. You look at the British ruling class in the 19th and 20th century. If you want to see some good anti-Semitism, the current queen's husband comes from this Greek anti-Semitic fascist family. All right? Look at the United States. You want to see anti-Semitism? Read about Henry Ford and what he thought of Jews. So Hitler's views weren't that extreme. He wasn't Adolf Hitler yet. So the world isn't appalled or shocked by him. So what he's doing, it's not nice, but it's not all that surprising either. I mean, look at what people like Keynes and Wilson said about the settlement at Versailles. What had they said, remember? They said, this is what's going to happen. The extremists in Germany will take over as a repudiation of what this horrible settlement will do to them. $33 billion in reparations. Unheard of, absurd. 10 times more than Keynes said the Germans could ever handle. So what do you expect? You expect the Germans to act like kind of moderately and reasonably under those circumstances? This is what Keynes and even Wilson agreed to. And Keynes thought Wilson was an idiot, but on this point they agreed. So Hitler takes over. He talks peace, but immediately he withdraws from a global conference on disarmament, and in October 1933 he withdrew from the League of Nations. All right. In 1934, he begins to support the Australian Nazi Party. One of Hitler's ideas was that all of the countries in Central Europe had ethnic Germans in them. And look at this, we can even be interactive. And if you look at in this area here, Czechoslovakia, Poland, Austria, all of these places have a large number of people who are ethnically German, just as Texas has a large proportion of people who are ethnically Mexican or Mexican-American, right? Hitler's argument was that these states, which have large numbers of people who are ethnically German, ought to belong to a greater Germany, basically a German empire. So in 1934, he begins to support Austrian Nazis who have a goal of Anschluss, which was the term you probably saw in there. Anschluss basically means a union with Nazi Germany. I believe, does anybody know German in here?
No.
Okay. I think Anschluss means union or unity or something like that, if you translate it. What it means is the Anschluss means that the states that have large numbers of ethnic Germans will unite. There will be a unity, all right? A movement for all of us to join together as a greater Germany, all right? An Anschluss. In Austria, the Nazis, just as the Nazis in Germany were attacking Jews, attacking socialists, attacking trade unions, the Austrian Nazis were doing the same thing with Hitler's support. And so it's pretty clear then that Hitler has ambitions beyond simply being, in charge of Germany. But again, is that unusual for Germany to assert control over Central Europe? No. This is Germany. Remember the old spheres of influence, balance of power? Britain has its empire. Britain has great influence over the Balkans. France and Russia traditionally have been allies. Russia and Serbia have been allies. And Germany has had control over Central Europe. Who was Germany's ally in World War I? Austria-Hungary, the Habsburgs, right? So how is this really all that different? Not really, right? So on one hand, people say, he's not a nice guy, but this isn't all that different than what we've seen before. The French were alarmed by it because anything Germany does is going to alarm the French. Reasonably, right? 1871, 1914. So France actually goes to the League of Nations and gets the Soviet Union admitted into the League. If there's one state throughout the entire 30s and one global leader who is always alarmed about Hitler, who's always warning about Hitler, who would it be? Stalin, even more than the French. If anybody is worried about Hitler and alarmed by him, it is Joe Stalin, because who is the number one enemy, according to Hitler? We all know about Hitler's views on the Jews, but the communists were up there with them, right? And if you're the West, if you're Britain or France or the US, and you hear Hitler blaming Stalin and the communists for everything, what do you think? That's not so bad, is it? He's on our side. We feel the same way. So Hitler isn't Adolf Hitler yet. This is the young Elvis, right? This is before the peanut butter and banana sandwiches. Hitler. The stable, yeah. We'll talk a bit about that. Anyway, let's go out and have a beverage and then come back here and watch me dig a deeper hole for myself, right?